Okay, well, I think it's 2 o'clock now, so we can make a start. This is the third of a series of webinars that Whitehall Training have run. The first was an introduction to good clinical practice, and the second was an introduction to good laboratory practice. So let's launch into the webinar and start talking about pharmacovigilance. So the first question is just what is pharmacovigilance actually for? Well, it's to protect and prevent patients from suffering unnecessary harm and protect them from unnecessary harm. It contributes to the risk-benefit balance of medicines by contributing to the risk part of the equation. It communicates, or it's used to communicate safe and proper use of medicines, and it contributes to the protection of patients' health and public health. So if I talk a little bit about how pharmacovigilance came about, you can't do that without talking about thalidomide. I'm sure all of you know what thalidomide is, but it was prescribed in many countries around the world, but actually never in the US. It was sold and prescribed during the late 50s and early 60s to pregnant women as an antiemetic to combat morning sickness and as an aid to help them sleep. However, it was later discovered that it's a teratogen and it caused extreme birth abnormalities. However, these weren't reported as adverse events at the time because there wasn't a reporting system in existence. So it took a few years for people to twig what was actually happening with the drug. As a result, inadequate tests were performed to assess the drug's safety, with catastrophic results for the children of women who'd taken the drug during their pregnancies. In 1962, the US enacted some legislation, which I'll try and pronounce correctly, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which required tests for safety during pregnancy before a drug could receive approval for sale. Other countries and regions brought in very similar legislation, and as a result, thalidomide wasn't prescribed or sold for decades. The US amendment also mandated that adverse events needed to be reported to the FDA. So this was essentially the birth of pharmacovigilance. Now, terminology is extremely important. Pharmacovigilance is one of those subjects where the devil is very much in the detail. So it's important to make sure that the correct terminology is used and it's used correctly. So the first one, which is a term that most people will have come across, adverse event. This is an untoward medical occurrence in a patient or subject. Fairly straightforward. Subject being the name that's given to a patient in a clinical trial. Now, with an adverse event, there is no necessarily causal relationship with a product. So all it is an unfortunate event, untoward medical occurrence. Now, in pharmacovigilance, the concept of seriousness is quite important. Therefore, you can have an SAE, which is a serious adverse event. I'll talk a little bit about how things are classified as serious or non-serious a little bit later. So, an adverse drug reaction, this is where you have a response to a product that's noxious and unintended. So the difference between an ADR and an AE is that with an ADR, there's a level of causality. So the term response is related to where there's a causal relationship to a medical product. So it's known, or at least a reasonable possibility. So it's an adverse event with a causal relationship. Forgive me if I seem to be laboring these points, but this is very important to get this right straight on. And as I said, the concept of seriousness is important in pharmacovigilance. So as a result, you have an SADR or an SAR, which is a serious adverse drug reaction. Now, before a medicine is approved for use, clinical experience with it is quite limited. So causality is an important concept in clinical trials, and there is a requirement to ascertain the difference between events, which is just adverse events that have happened, and reactions that may or may not be related to investigational product. So bear that in mind. There's also another thing. Someone's clicking. I think someone's left their microphone on. Slight word of warning with SADR and SAR. Some people use the S to mean suspected. So that would mean an SADR is a suspected ADR. Technically, this isn't right, because once something's classed as an ADR, you already have the causality in there. So it's far safer to use SADR or SAR purely to mean serious adverse drug reaction.
So to move on, a term that anyone who's got any experience with pharmacovigilance will be very familiar with, the SUSAR, which is the suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction. So again, it's there's a causality there, so it counts as a reaction. And in pharmacovigilance, the topic of it, the concept of expectedness of it is very important. And what this essentially means is that a SUSAR is an unexpected reaction or event where the nature or the severity of the adverse event is not consistent with the particular product information. Now, if that's a product during a clinical trial, the information will be the investigator's brochure. If it's a post-marketing product, so it's one that's on the general release, then it would be the package insert or the summary of product characteristics. So a SUSAR is therefore an adverse event that is unexpected according to the product information, it's serious, and it's an adverse drug reaction. So it's considered to be causally related to the product. So in a clinical trial, SUSARs always need expedited reporting to the competent authority, which is the regulatory authority involved in the trial. Outside of a clinical trial, generally both unexpected and expected serious adverse drug reactions need to be reported to competent authorities. So there you are. A SUSAR is an unexpected reaction or event where the nature or severity of the adverse event is not consistent with the applicable product information. Now, the next bit of terminology might surprise some of you. It's EU or EEA. Now, the reason why this is important in pharmacovigilance is that quite often we refer to EU legislation, the rules in the EU, etc., etc. When we do that, what we're actually referring to is the European Economic Area, which is slightly wider than the EU. The reason for this is that the EEA includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, and who knows, it might end up including the UK, who are not within the European Union, but have adopted the complete EU pharmacovigilance legislation. So just bear in mind, if you see something referring to EU legislation, it's actually slightly wider than the EU. So let's talk about the two areas where pharmacovigilance is important. During clinical trials, I'll talk about this first, and in a post-market situation, so when the drug is actually on the shelves. There's a number of positives for pharmacovigilance data within clinical trials, and some of them are quite clear. You've got a very highly controlled environment within clinical trials with strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. You know the denominator, so you know precisely the number of people who've been treated with a drug, which means you can get very accurate figures on the incidence of adverse drug reactions. Data is collected on standardized forms. You normally have follow-up information, and any report is medically confirmed. So you can see all of this means that clinical trials are a very good source of very clean, accurate, reliable pharmacovigilance data. Okay, so there are some negatives.
One is that it's a small sample size. Large trials may well have several hundred or even thousands of subjects, but that's still a drop in the ocean when you compare it with the number of people who'll be taking a drug once it's actually launched. So very rare events might not occur. It's a restricted population. So a trial might exclude certain groups of people, it might exclude children, it might exclude elderly men or women. So adverse events that occur mainly in the excluded groups might not be seen or might be underrepresented. Narrow indications. Inclusion and exclusion criteria might not be 100% match for the real world. And also, not all concomitant medicines are going to be tested. It's not practical. Short duration. Trials normally last 1 to 3 years, so any really long-term effects aren't going to be detected. The final thing is surrogate measures might be used. What I mean by this is that clinical trials that are investigating potentially fatal outcomes like heart attacks might instead look for surrogate markers like raised blood pressure or lipid levels. However, these don't 100% map across into the fatal outcome. So let's talk about pharmacovigilance after clinical trials. So after the drug's actually on the market, as you'd expect, there are some positives, lots of data. So rare adverse events are definitely going to be present. Long-term effects ought to be detected. There's a wide range of concomitant medications, and it should include all types of patients. And finally, actual fatalities are going to be recorded and included in the data. So there are positives, as you'd expect, there are negatives too. The reports are going to be from a very wide range of sources. They could come from patients, relatives, other non-healthcare providers. Data's often incomplete. There's potential duplication. A patient may well report an adverse drug reaction themselves. They could also tell their GP, who separately reports it. So the risk of potential duplication is quite high. There's no denominator data. Only sales data. You know how many drugs have been sold, but you can't know for sure exactly how many patients have taken a particular substance. So why do both? Well, they both have advantages, as I've said before. The main advantages in a nutshell of pre-market are it's needed to protect trial participants. It gives you clean and reproducible data, and it can feed into the risk-benefit analysis that you need to carry out before a drug is launched on the market. Post-market, you can continue to develop and adapt the risk-benefit analysis as more information is gained. Potentially, labels might need changing. You might have to feed into an existing risk management plan, or possibly a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is what this REMS thing is, if necessary. And also it could prompt the production of a Dear Doctor letter. Now, what a Dear Doctor letter is, it's pretty straightforward. It's a term that is widely used in the US to describe any direct communication to a healthcare professional where they need to be informed of new safety information. So as soon as the safety information is updated, a Dear Doctor letter goes out. Now the letter, it has actually been formally replaced by a related term, which is Dear Healthcare Professional, though Dear Doctor is still very widely used in the US and beyond. The European equivalent is the Direct Healthcare Professional Communication, or DHCP. Again, Dear Doctor letter is still widely used. So let's give you some examples of kind of adverse events that could be seen. Unwanted effects. Now, these are, if you like, the stereotype side effects that patients tend to think of when they take drugs. So unwanted effects like headache, nausea, dizziness. There could be physical reactions such as elevated blood pressure, pallor or swelling. Abnormal lab tests. Now, these might not be noticed by the patient themselves, but if for some reason they have these tests done, things like increased hemoglobin, decreased hemoglobin rather, increased liver enzymes, things like that could be detected. The other possibility is overdose. Other examples of AEs, changes in baseline health of the patient. So worsening symptoms of a treated condition. Perhaps there's a change in a concomitant illness, so not the illness that the drug was actually intended to treat. And there could be events that are related to concomitant medication. Now notice I'm talking about AEs here, not ADRs, because this is adverse events. We haven't got a causality yet. Okay, so it's important to bear that in mind. Now, there's 3 factors that are used to assess adverse events and adverse drug reactions: seriousness, causality, and expectedness. So first of all, I'm going to talk about seriousness. So what is a serious adverse event or adverse drug reaction? Well, as the RIP headstone makes it quite clear, results in death is number 1 serious adverse event, and I'm sure everyone would agree with that. Next is life-threatening. By that we mean any adverse event that places a patient or subject, in the view of the investigator or GP or whoever, in immediate risk of death from the reaction as it occurred. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is it doesn't include a reaction that, if it was more severe, could have caused death. Okay, it's only serious if the reaction as it occurred was life-threatening. If somebody requires hospitalization for 24 hours or more, that's generally considered to be serious. If it results in persistent or significant incapacity, again, serious. And if it's medically significant, now this is a bit more complicated. Medically significant is where medical and scientific judgment has been exercised in deciding whether a particular situation ought to be considered serious, even though it doesn't meet one of the other criteria. So perhaps it could jeopardize the patient, or it might require intervention to stop it resulting in death, becoming life-threatening, requiring hospitalization, etc. So that's a slightly more grey area, and that requires medical input. Now, severity is not necessarily linked to seriousness. And someone's got their microphone on. As I said, severity is not necessarily linked to seriousness, and severity can go from mild to severe. Just to try and get that separation clear in your mind, I'm going to present you with 3 different examples. There's no need to put stuff in the chat box. I just want you to have a look at and think on each of these whether you would class this particular situation as serious. So is it serious or non-serious? And how intense is it? Is it mild? Is it highly intense? Whatever. So we've got the first example here. A patient feels nauseous, but they can go on with normal activities. Well, I think we all agree this is quite a clear one. It's not serious, and the severity is mild. There's no impact on their day-to-day life. So the next one, we'll slightly change this. The patient is feeling nauseous. They need to lie down. They can't get up without experiencing the symptom and needing assistance. Okay, so if you remember the seriousness criteria, it's not serious. They haven't died, it's not life-threatening, etc., etc. However, it is severely intense. They can't just shrug it off. They can't go on with their normal life. Final example, a patient falls unconscious. They have very low pulse and low blood pressure. and they need emergency medical care. Okay, well, I think this definitely falls under the category of serious, and I think it's fair to say it falls under the category of severe intensity. Okay, so let's now move on to causality. How you assess causality? Well, there's several different degrees of causality, if you like. First, something that's definitely related to a particular drug, probably related, possibly related, unlikely to be related, and definitely not related. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, that isn't particularly helpful, so it's generally better to convert that into a binary, either definitely related or definitely not related. So is related? How can you be sure that an adverse event is definitely related to a particular drug? Well, one, it can't be explained by the disease or the other drugs. Two, there may be a positive re-challenge. This is really the best proof that something's definitely related. And for those who don't know what a positive re-challenge is, it's where a drug is started and the symptoms are experienced. The drug is stopped and the symptoms get better. The drug is re-administered and the symptoms come back. So that is the best proof that something is definitely related. There should also be a plausible temporal relationship, so the timing fits. And also the adverse event should be pharmacologically definitive. So it's an objective and specific medical disorder. It's far harder to prove definite causality if the adverse event is something that isn't easy to objectively and specifically define. So now we'll look at expectedness. So really this is a binary. Expected, it's been seen before. To unexpected, not previously observed. Now, an expected adverse event is any adverse event whose nature and severity have been previously observed and documented for that particular product. An unexpected adverse event is one that hasn't been previously observed. Either that particular adverse event has not been observed, or it's not been observed in that degree of intensity before. Now, for a medicinal product that's under investigation, so it's not yet approved, it's the investigator's brochure that's used to assess expectedness. For a product that's approved, it's the packaging insert or summary of product characteristics used to assess expectedness, and those are usually abbreviated to the SPC or SMPC, summary of product characteristics. So now we're talking about expedited reporting. Now, lack of efficacy is not normally a criteria enough in itself to trigger expedited reporting, and I'll talk about what expedited reporting and aggregated reporting is in a moment. However, there are exceptions. If a drug is used to treat a life-threatening disease and the efficacy is shown to be low, or a serious disease, if it's a vaccine, or if it's a contraceptive, then it can be right to treat it as if it was an adverse event, so report it using expedited reporting. The only exception is for those of you, if there are any of you in Canada. In Canada, there is an expectation for lack of effect to be reported if it occurred within Canada using expedited reporting. So in Canada, lack of effect is also something that should be reported. So adverse drug reaction reporting, expedited reports triggered by specific events. So this is quite important. So a specific thing has happened. It could be pre-market or post-market. If it's pre-market, so if it's a clinical trial, there's a thought process you need to go through to determine just how you deal with an adverse event. So the first question you'd ask yourself is, has the test drug already been administered? If it's before the test drug's been administered, no further action. It's clearly not an adverse drug reaction. If it's after the test drug's been administered, is the reaction serious? Well, is the adverse event, serious? At this moment, you haven't determined causality. So it's an adverse event. So is it serious? No. So it's recorded in the case record form. Yes. Next question, was it expected? So as we've said, checking in the investigator's brochure, is it something that would be in there? Is it something that's been observed before? If it's yes, then you still need to tell the sponsor immediately, and they need to report it to the competent authority following the normal competent authority's deadlines and rules. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. If it wasn't expected, was it caused by the test drug in the investigator's opinion? So is there a degree of causality there? No. If the investigator thinks there really wasn't any causality, the sponsor still needs to be told, and they still need to report it to the competent authority. But if they believe it was caused by the test drug, the next question is, how serious is it? Is it potentially fatal? Also, all of the other things I mentioned that count as serious are in there as well. So did it cause hospitalization for over 24 hours, etc., etc. So if the answer to that is yes, the sponsor needs to be told immediately, and then they need to, within 7 days at an absolute maximum, report it to the competent authority where it happened, plus the competent authorities in other countries where trials might be going on, plus the ethics committee and investigators. After they've reported it, they then have an additional 8 calendar days to file their complete report. And the complete report needs to include an assessment of the importance and implication of the findings, including any relevant previous experience with the same or similar medicinal products. If it's not potentially fatal, then the same process applies, but they just have a little longer to do it. They have 15 days. So let's talk about post-market expedited reporting. Someone's just asked the question whether this webinar will be available afterwards. Yes, it will. I will send everyone a link to a recording of the webinar. So, post-market expedited reporting in the EU. You notice I put at the moment information current as of June 2020, and this applies to elsewhere as well, of course. So number one, if it's a post-marketing serious ADR that occurred within the EU, 15 days deadline. If it's a post-marketing serious ADR that occurred outside the EU, but for a product where there is a license within the EU, 15 days again. Once you get into non-serious ADRs occurring within the EU, then the deadline becomes much longer, 90 days. In the US, rather, there's a 15-day alert report, which is broadly similar to the EU. So that's for post-marketing serious unexpected ADRs. And in the US, non-serious ADRs are discussed in aggregated reports. I'll talk about aggregated reports in a minute. So, apart from adverse drug reactions, there are other things that are important to include in expedited reporting. I already said about the example of Canada, where lack of efficacy is something that should be reported. But if there's a clinically important increase in an expected adverse event incident, that should be reported. If some new findings, new safety findings from things like animal studies come to light, that should be reported. And if there's any change into significant hazards to the patient population, that should be reported. So what are the minimum criteria for an expedited report? Well, any report needs to be valid. It needs to have a certain amount of information to be of any use. So there are minimum criteria. Number one, it needs to have an identifiable patient. So an expedited report must have a name, well, identifiable patient, an identifiable reporting source. There must be a suspected medicinal product. That sounds obvious, but it's true. And then finally, it needs to define what the event was. And if remember, if it's a clinical trial, you might not have yet determined the causality. So that's why it says event. Reaction, if it's post-market, where you know there's a causality. So this is validity. Those four things is a valid report. So how is expedited reporting done? In the EU, there's a system called ADR Vigilance. This is a system for managing and analysing information on adverse reactions to any medicine that's been authorised or is being studied in clinical trials in the European Union, or EEA, as I said before. Now, the system has got a centralised computer database, and it was created and it's maintained by the EMA. ADRs are entered directly into ADR Vigilance, and sometimes adverse events of special interest in clinical trials need to be reported into ADR Vigilance, even if there isn't a causality that's definitely decided. So that's why we mentioned events before rather than reactions when it's a clinical trial. In the US, rather, the system is based around the form FDA 3500A, or MedWatch. The information from the MedWatch forms goes into this FAERS system, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, which is the US equivalent of ADR Vigilance. It's a database that contains all of the adverse event reports, medication error reports, product quality complaints, anything like that that results in adverse events that are submitted to the FDA. So what about outside the EU and the US? A lot of places use this thing called a SIOMS form. SIOMS is the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. Now, a few years ago, SIOMS developed this SIOMS Form 1. This form provides a standardized format for the reporting of suspected adverse reactions to any particular medical product. It's been widely used since the 1980s, although a lot of places use a more expanded version than the one-page version that was originally introduced. It's still used in some countries who don't have their own system. So let's talk about aggregated reporting. As the name suggests, it aggregates a number of adverse event reports over a specific period. So in pre-market situations, aggregated reporting is based around the DSUR, which is an annual requirement in Europe, and it stands for the Development Safety Update Report. That format can be optionally used in the US, although the US has its own format, which is the IND annual report. So IND for investigational new drugs. Post-marketing, again, there's a European form, the Periodic Safety Update Report, which can optionally be used in the US as well, although the US has its own PADR, PAER. Okay, this stands for Periodic Adverse Drug Experience Report, or Periodic Adverse Experience Report. So slight complication, as is ever the case. The PSUR, there is a new version of it which focuses on the benefit risk assessment, and that's been adopted by the EU, and that's often known as the PBRER, or Periodic Benefit Risk Evaluation Report. Those need to be submitted every 6 months after marketing authorization has been granted, until a product's been on the market for 2 years, and then every year for 2 following years. In the US, the PADER is required quarterly for the first 3 years from the date of approval and annually after that. And if you remember, I mentioned the form 3500A. Each adverse event in the PADER also includes a form 3500A. So it's the same form whether you're aggregate reporting or expedited reporting in the US. Okay, so this is the end of the general part of talking about pharmacovigilance. I can't really ignore the impact of COVID-19. Now, with pharmacovigilance, in some ways, the pharmacovigilance industry should be better prepared than many other industries for things like COVID-19. Section, I've got here the IB 11.3, which is part of the EU's GVP Module 1. So it's the Good Pharmacovigilance Practice first module from the EU. That particular section lists out all of the things that need to happen regardless. So it lists the tasks that need to carry on and requires risk-based business continuity plans to have been put into place. When I email out the information following this webinar, I will email you all the link to this IB 11.3. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can read a little bit more. But essentially, like most regulated industries, pharmacovigilance has an inbuilt requirement for disaster recovery planning. Although, to be perfectly honest, COVID-19 has stretched things somewhat. It's a real test of people's planning. So different agencies have released their own guidance on prioritizing pharmacovigilance activities. This includes things like leeways on reporting deadlines. Some of them have been slightly relaxed, but generally not if it's to do with COVID-19 trials. As you can appreciate, the amount of trials into COVID-19 has just soared and soared, and with those, pharmacovigilance needs to be followed, because the last thing we want is a quickly development drug that turns out to be dangerous. So the two documents, again, I will send you the links to these, is the US guidance for industry post-marketing adverse event reporting for medical products and dietary supplements during a pandemic. I'll send you the link to that, and also the guidance on remote GCP inspections from the European Medicines Agency. Okay, so there's other impacts of pharmacovigilance during COVID-19. As I said, massive increase in COVID-19 clinical trial work. And what this has actually done is it's increased the need for trained pharmacovigilance professionals. So if you were thinking of joining, excuse me, the pharmacovigilance community, then now is probably a good time to do it, but be quick. There are also potential issues regarding the supply of products. Now, what I mean by this is that for some particular drugs, take the example of anti-epileptics, if there's an effect on the supply chain, then they have quite a narrow therapeutic dose window. So therefore, the patients taking them are generally advised to stick with exactly the same brand. Now, obviously, this won't necessarily be possible because of supply chain problems. So this makes it particularly important to make sure that any adverse drug reactions are detected and reported efficiently. Okay, so this is the end of the formal part of this presentation. I'm going to deal with a couple of questions. Some people have sent in a few questions. One is, in my company, medical reps would always report a patient death as an adverse drug reaction. Is this correct? Whoops, excuse me. Several companies do this, and it's completely understandable. No company wants to be accused of failing to report something as serious as a death, but strictly speaking, a death on its own is an outcome and not necessarily an event. What I mean is that if you look at a death certificate, it doesn't say cause of death, death. For example, if a patient suffers a cardiac arrest and then dies, the cardiac arrest is the event and the outcome is death. So it sounds like I'm kind of splitting hairs. Why is this important? Okay, well, let's take an example of a painkiller that's mainly used by late-stage cancer patients. There is a risk that the reporting is going to end up swamped by false positives. So if one of these cancer patients, for instance, dies when a bus runs them over, should the death be reported? If a known adverse drug reaction is severe dizziness, perhaps it should. There are always going to be company-specific variations. For example, a company might have several seriousness criteria rather than just serious or non-serious, but it's always safest to go by the definitions in the regulations if you want to avoid confusion. In the minimum criteria for expedited reports, surely causality should be included. Yes and no. If it's during a clinical trial, the event should be reported, regardless of whether causality has been determined. Remember the flowchart that I went through. Right. There are exceptions even to this rule, such as clinically important increases in expected adverse event incidents, new animal toxicity results, etc., and lack of efficacy in Canada, as I mentioned before. Thank you very much for listening. Our next webinar is going to be on good distribution practice. This will take place 2 weeks from today. If you're interested, then please go to whitehalltraining.com/GDP webinar. For those of you who don't know, good distribution practice includes areas of quality control, manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, quality assurance, regulation and compliance. So in the webinar, we'll be discussing how GDP quality is maintained throughout the distribution network so that an authorized medicine is distributed from the manufacturer to the user without its properties changing in any way. We'll also discuss ways in which the supply chain can be protected from counterfeit products. So just a quick recap, Whitehall Training, we've got a wide range of mainly online training. We do offer training that's supplemented by face-to-face or blended learning if necessary. We have got a pharmacovigilance course that's 4 modules for people who want to delve a little bit deeper. And I will be sending out a special discount code so that if you are interested in learning more, you can get a 50% discount on any of the pharmacovigilance courses by entering a code at the checkout. There are quite a few things, as you'd imagine, in those modules that I haven't covered. It's 4 modules: drug safety, global regulation, pharmacovigilance audit, and signaling and risk detection. And I've really not covered the final 2 at all in this particular talk. You can also contact me directly on that email address if you either want to be invoiced, if you want to purchase by invoice, if you're interested in corporate rates for training, or if you're interested in any of our other products, like, as I said before, clinical trial management systems, ethics review products, or tissue sample tracking. Okay, well, it really just falls on me to say thank you very, very much to everyone for participating in this. And hopefully I will see some of you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.